Hi y'all, welcome back to my channel. This is a Survivor's Guide to Life. My name is Jessica Lang and I am a licensed marriage and family therapist here to talk to you all about trauma, the brain, also attachment, and healing. So if that's your jam, go ahead and click that subscribe button down below so you can be notified every time I upload a new video. So for today's topic, I am going to be talking about the window of tolerance. The window of tolerance is something that we all have. It basically describes a window of what you can tolerate when you basically become stressed out. So for people who don't have a trauma history or don't have any issues with attachment or anything like that, they have a pretty large window of tolerance. That means that they can kind of take a lot of, for lack of a better word, hits with daily life stressors without completely succumbing to hypoarousal or hypoarousal, which I'm going to get into soon, states of arousal where, you start to kind of dissociate or you become extremely kind of agitated, and that's where you get your emotional outbursts and things like that. So with the large window of tolerance, it basically just means you can tolerate a lot more than somebody who has a smaller window of tolerance. I also want to add that when you're thinking about the window of tolerance, you're also thinking about what the stress response system, which is something that we all have, and it's part of the self-protection mechanism that we have that notifies us whether that we are in danger, right? That there's some type of threat and it's time to activate certain behaviors that ensure that we will be safe, that we will take care of ourselves, that we will survive, basically. So when you're talking about the window of tolerance and having a large one versus a small one, it's kind of the think about it as how much input you need before that stress response system kicks in and starts to deploy those defensive actions of fight, flight, or freeze. So when you have repeated traumas that start during childhood or over the course of one's lifetimes, over the course of one's lifetime, what happens is that stress response system is constantly being deployed, and the fight, flight, freeze mechanisms kick in. Those are the behavioral adaptations that you use to protect yourself. So if that happens repeatedly, then you start to become what we call sensitized to things in the environment that trigger, that basically say, be on guard, this thing over here is gonna come hurt you. And so what that does is it basically shrinks that window. Or if it happened, over the course of your childhood, you start off with one that's pretty small, and you need, typical, you need stressors, you need to be tested and some, for lack of a better word, to kind of grow that resilience so you can see that you can tolerate a lot more. And that happens over the course of one's development over their lifetime. But when and that's typical, right? It's consistent. It's, with the support of, loving caregivers, etc. That's how you develop a large window of tolerance. But with the trauma, what it is it's inconsistent stressors or inconsistent parenting or feeling emotionally unsafe, whatever the things that basically make you feel like, or make the child feel like their system, their body, their person is under threat. Those are the ones that actually make that window smaller. So what you have this is your window of tolerance. And when you become triggered, that stress response system kicks in. What happens is you can move into the hyper aroused zone, which is the part up top, or you move down below, which is your hypo aroused zone. So I'm going to talk about both of them so you can kind of get an understanding of maybe what happens for you, or maybe if you notice with your child or somebody you care about that this is something that they do. So when you kind of tip over and fall out of your window of tolerance, and you go into the hyper-aroused zone, some things you may be feeling or experiencing, or things that you might do, are you might be feeling anxious, you might get a little more agitated, your heart might be beating faster, right? Maybe you're sweating, maybe you're feeling something in your stomach. You feel kind of the urge to move, so you might feel a little bit more fidgety, or you might want to go run or try to figure out a way to escape. Maybe you're looking, you notice like you're shifting gaze and you start looking at exits because you're trying to figure out a way to get out. Maybe your speech becomes really pressured or fast, right? These are all kinds of signs, and basically it's a feeling of out of control. Like you can't really manage it and they're just happening. Conversely, if you're moving into the hypoaroused zone, what you're talking about more is your dissociative or your depressive states, lower energy, you start to move slower. Maybe you start to feel your brain kind of fog out. You start to feel a little bit more numb. You start having this kind of urge to disconnect. You might feel really stuck and unable to move. So think of like a hyper-aroused place of being as more active, right? What we call like a mobilizing defense, and then the hypo-aroused piece being more inactive or immobilizing. And that's where you get some of that dissociation. You might also in that hypo-aroused zone might feel kind of an urge or a sensation or feeling that you're feeling trapped or stuck in some way. And it's kind of like a panicky feeling, right, before you start to numb out. One thing that I also noticed that I didn't mention that just popped into my head that I noticed with the clients that I've worked with, especially children who are more hyper aroused and they begin to talk about their trauma, is that they vacillate between this tearfulness, they're crying about what's going on and it's, it might be a spontaneous memory that came to their mind that they felt like talking about, so they start getting tearful and very sad as they're talking about what happened, and then suddenly like a light switch got flipped, they're really agitated and angry about what happened. And so that is kind of one of those signs that they are in that hyper aroused zone, and that what we need to do is take a break and start to have them do some coping strategies because they are starting to relive the experience. So I just wanted to kind of pinpoint that out there. It's like that's another common sign that you've now moved out of the window of tolerance. And when you're talking about trauma, and especially, I primarily work with people who've experienced sexual abuse, part of the resolution in the healing is the integration of the memories, because what happens is when you experience trauma, some parts of it are extremely nonverbal, especially when they happen during childhood. So those get trapped and stored in your body. And so they become connected with different feelings and thoughts and sensations that you have. And so we have to decouple all of that, right? And unpack that so that you can start to parse out, like, this is the present, that was the past. What you want is like an autobiographical memory and able to talk about the experience without actually reliving the experience. That's part of memory and part of healing. And so if you are somebody who starts to talk about it and you start to actually relive it, that's a cue that you should stop having that conversation, even though there might be a reason that's compelling you to express that. You're starting to relive it, and that's actually not necessarily cathartic. So I just wanted to kind of put that caveat out there. So the reason I wanted to talk about the window of tolerance and discuss what it is precisely was because we all have things that we do. We call them resources, things in our toolbox that we use when we become stressed or agitated or, in your trauma response, that re-regulates you, right? That calms you down so that you can then move ahead to the next task or process what's going on without fully losing yourself in the emotional experience of what was going on. And so some of these things that I described, these behaviors that a person has, dissociation, right, anxiety, anger outbursts, these are not, we call them maladaptive coping strategies because you don't really have control over them. They kind of can overtake you and prevent you from doing things that you really want to do or engaging in behaviors that you're not so proud of. So they're maladaptive coping strategies. And by being able to figure out what zone you're in, you can actually then utilize more adaptive or positive coping strategies to cope with what's going on. So one of the biggest skills that is important with trauma healing is to find a way to bring yourself back into your window of tolerance, right? Because we all have a certain amount that we can tolerate. And this is what self-regulation is all about. And so here's 4 tips that you can utilize to return yourself to your window of tolerance so you're not dissociating or having anger outbursts and fighting with the people that you care about. So step number 1 is to identify your triggers. Triggers are things that remind you either through your 5 senses, so sight, sound, taste, touch, smell, that's the one I forgot, are those things that are reminders of your traumatic past and kick in that stress response system, and you'll start to feel it in your body when it's happening. Sometimes, depending on where you are on your journey, you might be able to articulate or identify it just before it happens, or you might be able to go back after it's all gone through and you do some reflection and figure out what it was after. Just depends where you are in your healing journey. So to identify your triggers, it's to think about for your triggers, it's things that come in through the five senses, as well as maybe some thoughts or specific feelings or body sensations that have been connected through the past experiences that then send you kind of into a tailspin of your trauma reaction, and you're feeling like you are actually in danger, in threat. This first step is to identify what your triggers are. Step number 2 is a little bit harder. It is to find out what is happening, kind of like the precursor behavior, or what happens as you're like dancing on the edge of that window of tolerance just before, so like that sweet spot before where you're on the line of it and when you fall completely off of it. Some people experience like kind of trembling before, or tingling in their extremities, or fingers or hands or feet, right? They start to feel certain body sensations that let them know, wait, this is becoming overwhelming. You might start to notice, maybe thoughts floating out of your head, like your brain kind of emptying, or you might suddenly realize you are hyper focused on an exit, or you're hyper focused on the person you're talking to's hands, because maybe, as a child, before you got hit, you noticed the hands of the abuser. You kind of get what I'm saying? So you start to notice that your gaze shifts to a particular part of a person's body, or you're looking at an exit. Again, you have some of the internal stuff. Maybe you're sweating, right? Those are some ways that you can kind of identify that you're dancing on that line there, and you're about to fall over into either the hyper aroused zone or down to the hypo aroused zone. Number 3 is to use grounding techniques to reground yourself, so that you can allow for that cortex piece that I've talked about in lots of other videos, right? The piece that kind of mediates those bottom up, I need to go protect myself, whatever means necessary, this is a danger. So you use grounding techniques to basically stabilize yourself in the present moment, and it helps you to bring that cortex back online, and also so you can differentiate, because when you're reliving these things, your body really does feel like you're under threat. This is something that's happening again, just like in the past. So it's to help kind of decouple and detangle. This is the present, that was the past. So you can do that by using a 5 senses grounding technique. And basically what you do is you will look around and name 5 things that you can see. You can do it in your head, you can do it out loud, depends where you are, obviously, context matters, right? And as you're doing this, you're taking in a deep breath, then you're exhaling, right? So you're slowing down the process. So you just do 5 things that you can see. You can do, and I always do 5 things that you can see as the number 1, because it's a lot easier to identify things that you can see, and that's, it's just easier. But the rest of them, you can just kind of play around with the numbers. So it can be like 4 things that you can touch. I also like to do 4 things that you can touch, because you could typically like touch your arm. You might be able to, feel your feet on the ground, or touch something on the table. And then these other ones that you can kind of mix it up. So it might be 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste, right? So that you're just centering yourself and stabilizing yourself in the present, to help reorient yourself. There's other types of grounding techniques and grounding exercises that you can look at, but I just prefer that one. My clients all say that they like it, and I think it's the best one. And just again, it's good to use. And then number 4, playing deep breathing exercise, right, while reminding yourself that you are okay, you are safe. You're steadying yourself. You want to at this time also think mindfully. Maybe start to explore, what is it about this situation that's got me activated? Don't try to stop it. I mean, if it becomes overwhelming, it's okay then to take a break. Okay, I can't do this right now. And, either put that on the shelf and deal with it later, or, go take a run, or whatever you need to do. But what you really want to do in these moments is, if you can, right? It's an if you can thing. Mindfully get curious about what is happening right now for you. What about this experience is triggering you? What about this situation has you flooded? And just get curious about it, take note of it, and then, maybe with your therapist or journal later, really kind of dive deep into it and notice like what was going on in your body at that moment, because those are cues that you can use later on as you're exploring your triggers, to go, okay, this is becoming too much. Now I need to go deploy, a more positive coping mechanism to deal with what's going on. So rather than just kind of allowing yourself to float off and dissociate, which is, again, it's a coping strategy that worked, but can be maladaptive when you're not in danger. You can then say, instead of me dissociating, I feel myself floating away, maybe instead I'm going to reach out to somebody and just, hey, can I talk to you for a second? Or maybe you're going to go for a walk. Or, with kids that I work with, they might have some issues with sensory integration. So they might go swinging on the swing or spinning in a chair, whatever they need to do to kind of regulate themselves and reground themselves again. And then they can go back to the task at hand. So that's all I have for you today. Talking about the window of tolerance, what it has to do with trauma, and what you can do to expand your window of tolerance so you can develop positive self-regulation tools and feel just a little bit more confident and competent and empowered. So that's all I have. Please check out my social media handles down below. Follow me on Instagram, where I post daily tips and tricks and things, life things that you might find useful. You may also join my Facebook group, which is the Survivor's Guide to Life, and it's just a supportive community. I share tools and tips and tricks, basically like Instagram anyway, but it's another place where you can connect with other people who've maybe experienced trauma, so that you don't feel so alone, and you can ask questions, and I'll answer, people answer, things like that. It's a small community right now, so join in. And so that's all I have for you guys today, and I will see you in the next one.